Is India a secular country? Ask this question to 10 Indians and you will probably hear 10 different answers. Some will proudly say, India has always been secular. Others will reply, no, India was never secular. Some will blame the politicians, some will blame the constitution itself. And within minutes, what began as a discussion turns into an argument. But what if I told you, almost everyone is debating the answer before understanding the question? Because before asking whether India was ever secular, we first need to ask ourselves, what exactly is secularism? And here is the surprising element. To find that answer, we don't begin our journey in Delhi or in Banaras or even in the Indus Valley. We begin nearly 7,000 kilometers away in Europe. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your king has changed his religion. Overnight, the faith you followed yesterday has become illegal today. Sounds unbelievable, but that's exactly what happened in Europe for centuries. Kings claimed that they ruled by the will of God. Religion wasn't just a matter of personal belief. It decided the politics, the power, and sometimes even whether you lived or died. Then came one of the darkest chapters in European history. The Catholics and the Protestants fought brutal wars for decades. Cities were reduced to ruins. Millions of people lost their lives. The very famous 30 Years' War alone devastated much of the Central Europe. Finally, Europe realized something very important. If the state chooses one particular religion over everyone else, peace becomes almost impossible. The very famous political philosopher Charles Taylor explains that secularism wasn't created because people stopped believing in God. It emerged because societies needed a way for the people of different faiths to live together without constantly fighting. In simple words, secularism was not born as an ideal, it was born as a solution. And this changes the entire discussion about India. Because if secularism itself is only a few hundred years old, can we honestly ask whether Emperor Ashoka or Emperor Akbar were secular? That's like asking whether the Mauryan Empire had a Wi-Fi. The question itself doesn't make sense. Ancient rulers never used the word secular. They couldn't have because the idea didn't even exist. So historians ask a different question. Not was India secular, but how did India manage people who believed in different gods, followed different traditions, and lived together under the same kingdom? And that's where India's story becomes truly fascinating. Because long before modern constitutions, long before the democracies, long before the word secularism was ever invented, India was already trying to solve one of the humanity's oldest challenges. That is, how do people with different beliefs live together? And the answer is far more complicated and far more interesting than most of us have been told. Let's now leave Europe behind and return to India. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the Indian subcontinent nearly 2000 years ago. There is no single language, no single king, no single holy book followed by everyone. People worship Shiva, Vishnu, Devi, Buddha, Mahavira, and countless local deities. Along the western coast, the Jewish communities have already found a home. In Kerala, early Christian communities begin to flourish. Centuries later, the Parsis arrive from Persia seeking the refuge, and India welcomes them. Very few civilizations around the world have carried such extraordinary diversity for such a long time. Historian Dina Eck describes India as a civilization where different faiths often shared the same social and cultural space rather than replacing one another. But don't misunderstand this. Diversity is not the same as secularism. Just because different religions existed together doesn't mean the state treated them all equally. History is never that simple. Let's begin with one of India's greatest emperors, Ashoka. Most of us know him as the king who won the Kalinga War, but the real story begins after the victory. Imagine a battlefield covered with thousands of dead soldiers. The empire celebrates, but the emperor doesn't. Instead, Ashoka looks around and realizes he has conquered a kingdom, but lost something far more valuable, his own peace of mind. That moment changes him forever. In his famous Rock Edict 12, Ashoka appeals to the people not to insult other faiths and to respect every religious tradition. He believed that honoring the other person's belief ultimately strengthens your own. For the 3rd century BC, this was a remarkable idea. But the question is, was Ashoka secular? Not really. He did not separate the religion from the state. In fact, his idea of Dhamma became part of the governance itself. He wasn't building a secular state. He was trying to build an ethical one. And those are two very different things. Now let's travel almost 1800 years forward. A Mughal emperor sits inside a palace at Fatehpur Sikri. But this isn't an ordinary royal meeting. Inside one particular hall, Hindu Pandits, Muslim ulemas, Jain monks, Jesuit priests from Portugal, and Zoroastrian scholars are all present. Not for a war, not for a treaty, but for a debate, a deliberation. This place was called as Ibadat Khana. And the emperor hosting these discussions was Akbar. Akbar abolished the jizya tax for a time, married Rajput princesses, included Hindu nobles in his administration, and promoted the idea of Sul-i-Kul, or peace with all. Historian Audrey Truschke argues that Akbar tried to create a political order where loyalty to the empire mattered more than religious identity. For the 16th century, this was revolutionary. But even Akbar wasn't secular in the modern sense. His authority still came from the monarchy. Religion and politics were still closely connected. He was governing a diverse empire, not separating religion from the state. And here is something many people don't know. History is full of examples that refuse to fit into today's political narratives. The Vijayanagara Empire, often remembered as a powerful Hindu kingdom, made grants to Jain institutions and employed Muslims in different capacities. The Mughal Empire relied heavily on Rajput journals and administrators. Several Deccan sultanates employed Hindu commanders and revenue officials. Politics often crossed the religious lines because kingdoms needed capable people far more than ideological purity. Historian Richard Eaton reminds us that medieval India cannot be understood simply as a story of one religion constantly fighting the another. Power, trade, geography, alliances, and economics mattered just as much as faith. That's what makes history so fascinating. It almost never fits into the neat boxes. So where does that leave us? By now, one thing is becoming very clear. Ancient and medieval India were not secular in the modern constitutional sense, but they were constantly experimenting with something equally challenging. That is, how do you govern people who pray differently without tearing the society apart? Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they failed. There were moments of remarkable accommodation among various people. There were also moments of violence, persecution, killings, and destructions. India's past contained both, and accepting both is what makes history honest. But the biggest turning point was still to come, because very soon a foreign power would arrive, one that would just not rule India. It would in fact fundamentally change the way Indians began to think about the religion, the identity, and the politics. And the effect of that change are still with us today. The British didn't just conquer India, they classified it. Before colonial rule, people certainly identified their religion, but the British slowly transformed these identities into political categories. Every census asked a question: who are you? Are you a Hindu or a Muslim, Sikh, Christian? For the first time, millions of people began seeing themselves not just as a member of a particular village or a large kingdom, but as a part of large religious communities spread across India. Historian Bernard Cohn called this particular thing the power of colonial enumeration. By counting the people, the British also changed how people imagined themselves, how they saw themselves. Then came separate electorates. Now, political representation itself was linked to religious identity. Religion was no longer just about faith. It had become a question of political power. And as history would show, that experiment came at a terrible cost. It's August 1947 and India is finally free. But freedom comes wrapped in tragedy. Trains arrive filled not with passengers, but with dead bodies. Families leave home they have lived in for generations. Neighbors who once celebrated the festivals together suddenly find themselves on the opposite sides of the border. Nearly 15 million people are displaced in one of the largest migrations in the human history. The country is bleeding. Now imagine this. While violence rages outside, inside a very big hall in Delhi, a group of men and women are trying to write the constitution of the new nation. They know one wrong decision could push India into another cycle of division. This was perhaps the greatest constitutional challenge independent India would ever face. How do you build one of the nations after religion has divided it? Many people believed the word secular has always been a part of the constitution. It wasn't. When the constitution came into force in 1950, the preamble did not contain the word secular. Does that mean India wasn't meant to be secular? Not at all. In fact, the framers believed the principle was already woven into the constitution itself, into the principles of the constitution itself. Article 25 guaranteed the freedom to practice and profess religion. Article 26 protected the management of religious affairs. Articles 29 and 30 protected the cultural and educational rights of minorities. In other words, the constitution didn't ask Indians to abandon their religion. It asked the state to treat every citizen with equal dignity. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was clear on one particular point. The state should never impose a religion on the people. At the same time, he also believed the state could step in when religion violated the constitutional values. That's why independent India abolished untouchability. That's why social reform became a constitutional responsibility. This was not hostility towards the religion. It was a commitment to the principles of justice. But then there was Mahatma Gandhi. And this is where India's story becomes unique. Gandhi never believed religion should disappear from public life. In fact, he spoke openly about spirituality and morality. Yet, he also believed every religion deserved equal respect. His idea was beautifully captured in the phrase Sarva Dharma Sambhava, that is, respect for all religions. Notice something interesting. Ambedkar and Gandhi, two very different personalities, two different philosophies, yet all of them were searching for the same answer. How can people of different faiths live together as equal citizens? Then came another important milestone. In the year 1976, during the emergency, the 42nd Constitutional Amendment inserted the words socialist and secular into the preamble. This is often misunderstood. The amendment did not suddenly make India secular. It simply gave an explicit constitutional expression to an idea that already existed through the fundamental rights and the overall constitutional frameworks. Years later, the Supreme Court went even further. In the very famous cases, for example, the landmark judgments of S.R. Bomai of 1994, the Supreme Court held that secularism is the very part of the basic structure of the Constitution, which actually means no government, regardless of its political ideology, can abolish it through a constitutional amendment. But here is where India surprises the world. When most people hear the word secularism, they imagine a strict wall between the religion and the state. That works well in countries like United States or in France. For example, France follows an even stricter model called as laïcité, where religion is expected to stay largely out of the public sphere. India chose neither. The very famous political philosopher Rajeev Bhargava calls India's model as that of principled distance. Think of it like this. The Indian state doesn't completely walk away from the religion, nor does it completely embrace any one particular religion. Instead, it keeps adjusting its distance whenever justice, equality, or social reform demands it. Sometimes the state manages temple administration. Sometimes it protects the minority educational institutions. Sometimes it reforms the religious practices through law. To an outsider, this may look inconsistent, but for India, it reflects something much deeper. A country of extraordinary diversity cannot always be governed by rigid formulas. Sometimes flexibility itself becomes the principle. And perhaps this is India's most important or original contribution to the global debate on secularism. But of course, not everyone agrees, because some of India's greatest thinkers believe even this model has serious limitations. So, has India actually succeeded in its experiment? Or is secularism still a work in progress? Let's find out. By now, you probably know the answer isn't a simple yes or a no. And that's exactly what makes India's story so fascinating. But before we conclude, there is one more twist. Not every scholar believes India's model of secularism has been a complete success. For example, sociologist T.N. Madan once argued that in a deeply religious society like India, expecting religion to remain confined to private life is simply unrealistic. For millions of people, religion isn't just about worship. It shapes the families, the festivals, the identity, and the everyday life. Political thinker Ashis Nandy offered another interesting perspective. He argued that India had long traditions of people living together despite their differences. According to him, when secularism was imported from Europe, it sometimes became a political slogan instead of a social practice. You may agree with him, you may disagree, but his question is worth thinking about. Can India solve its problems by copying Europe's answer? Perhaps not, because India's questions have always been different. And yet, there are also scholars who believe India has created something unique. Political philosopher Bhikhu Parekh argues that diversity is not a problem waiting for a permanent solution. It is a reality that every generation must learn to manage. That idea perfectly captures the Indian experience. Because India was never meant to become a country where everyone thinks alike, or worships alike, or even lives alike. India has always been a conversation, sometimes peaceful, sometimes loud, sometimes uncomfortable, but a conversation nonetheless. Now think about this. Today, India is home to almost every major religion in the world. Hundreds of languages, thousands of communities, countless traditions. Every day, millions of people visit temples, mosques, churches, gurudwaras, monasteries, synagogues. Yet, every 5 years, they stand in the same queue, holding the same voter ID, choosing the same parliament. This is not a small achievement. No civilization has managed diversity perfectly. Not Europe, not the Middle East, not America, and not India. Every society has struggled with prejudices, conflict, and discrimination. India has too. There have been riots, communal tensions, killings, political polarization, moments that have tested our constitution and our collective conscience. Ignoring all these realities would be dishonest. But ignoring India's achievements would be equally dishonest. Despite countless differences among various sections in society, despite the world's largest and the most diverse electorate, despite predictions that democracy here would fail, India continues to resolve its biggest political battles not through coups or civil wars, but through elections, courts, public debate, and constitutional institutions. That doesn't mean the system is perfect. It means the system survives. And sometimes that itself is extraordinary. So, was India ever secular? If by secular we mean a modern constitutional idea where the state has no official religion, then that journey truly begins only with independent India. Ancient and medieval kingdoms cannot be judged by the standards that did not exist in their time. But if the question is whether India has long searched for ways to accommodate different faiths, whether the rulers, the reformers, and the ordinary people have repeatedly tried to make diversity work, then history gives us countless examples, some inspiring, some painful, and all deeply human. Perhaps the real question was never, was India ever secular? Perhaps the better question is, can any civilization of India's size and diversity remain united without continuously reinventing the idea of coexistence? And maybe that is India's greatest lesson to the world. Not that it found a perfect formula, but that it never stopped searching for the one. There's a beautiful saying from the Rig Veda, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. Truth is one. The wise describe it in many ways. Centuries later, the constitution would echo that civilizational wisdom in a modern language, not by asking every Indian to believe the same thing, but by giving every Indian the freedom to believe differently. That is why India's story is much bigger, than the debate over one word. It is a story of a civilization that has constantly negotiated faith, identity, and freedom. Sometimes successfully, sometimes imperfectly, but always with the hope that people who pray differently can still live together as equal citizens. And perhaps that hope is India's greatest strength. Because civilizations are not remembered for never facing disagreements. They are remembered for how they choose to overcome them. India's journey is still unfinished. Its debates will continue. Its democracy will continue to evolve. And so will its understanding of secularism. Maybe that's exactly how it should be. Because the strength of a democracy is not that every citizen agrees. The strength of a democracy is that people with different beliefs still choose the same constitution. And in a world increasingly divided by the identity politics, that may well be India's most remarkable achievement. This is Bharat and Beyond. I'll see you in the next episode.